Everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Very pleased on this episode to be talking with author and creator Andy Runton. Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how are you today? I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Doing well, doing well. I'm excited to be talking with you. I've done sort of travels through the comics world and tried to think about various comics that can reach students of all ages, and love Alley, love the creative work that you do in the wordless comics format. So glad to be talking with you about that, and really curious about those initial steps. Like, what got you started on this world of creating and crafting in comics?
Well, first, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so it really goes all the way back to when I was first, learning how to read, really. I always, so let's see, it, it's an interesting story. So when I was really little, my mom was actually going back to school. And so as I was starting to learn how to read, I would also spend a lot of time in the library because she would be there doing projects and stuff like that. And at that time, you could just kind of let your kid wander around the library, and there was no, I mean, it's probably wasn't amazing, but everybody took care of me, and so I would just kind of hang out in the library, and I just gravitated towards the children's books, and
Hmm.
I loved anything that had pictures. I've always been drawn to visual art, always loved it. And when my mom was teaching me how to read, she would actually read me the comic book, the comic strips in the daily paper.
Yeah.
That was one of the big things. And little short little snippets. It was such a I think it's such a great thing because it's ongoing narratives, there's jokes, I really can't thank her enough for that. And so, I mean, I was just and I think that by doing that, she inadvertently taught me the language of comics, which I think a lot of people forget is a language. It really is. And you don't really realize that until you try to give a comic book or comic strip or anything to somebody who has not really read a lot of them, and they kind of get a little lost and they don't quite understand the shorthand. And for us that have been reading them our whole lives, we understand the visual cues, and we just pick up on all of these little things, just intuitively. And I think that that was a huge part of why I ended up doing what I do now, So um, I loved stories. I loved drawing. I loved being able to do that kind of stuff. But the leap from drawing to creating stories is a big one. That is because a lot of people like to draw, but when you start to try to write your own stories, it gets that's a next level, of difficulty, like just
Hmm.
massive jump. And I had some friends in high school, so I read comics all through grade school. And when I got into high school, so I was in high school, I graduated in 1992. So it was like late 80s when I was in high school. And that was like comic book heaven, and I had friends that were into all kinds of comics, but I also loved cartoons, and I watched the GI Joe and the Transformers cartoons when they were on TV. And that
Absolutely.
actually, they would actually run ads for comic books because that was something they could advertise that weren't toys. I find out later that they could advertise these comics, and they weren't under regulations that it was to advertise toys. And so it got me looking for comics, and I actually found, um, there was a little spinner rack at one of my little it was this little convenience store called Little Champ that was right down from my house. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and they had a ton of comics. And my mom would go in there and buy stuff, and I would get a comic, and they were probably like $2 or something like that at the time. And I started reading GI Joe comics. That was the thing that started me reading comics. And that's where I really got hooked. And this was a whole new storyline. And um, I didn't know about comic book stores. And so I also didn't know that comic books came out on a schedule. I didn't know that until way, way later, like college level. I had no concept that these things came out regularly, So
Mhm.
whenever we would go to the store, I would get something and suddenly I missed something, like I'm reading and you're like, what's going on? I don't know what's happening here. And I had to track down a comic book store that had back issues. And once I walked into a comic book store, it's a used book slash comic book store, I could not believe the world that opened up to me in these stores because the store that I went to, if you can imagine this, it was such a crazy system. So this would have been like, I don't know, 84, 85, no, maybe even earlier than that, 82. Um, when you walked into this bookstore, behind the counter, on the wall behind them, they had all the comics like in a, like, I guess they were in sleeves at the time, but they were on these sliders on the back. So you could just like, I want that one and that, but you had to tell them, right? And then they would, they would hand it to you in a brown paper bag. It was the craziest thing. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it was very secretive and very odd. And but the thing was is that and then they had long boxes full of back issues that I didn't find those for a long time because I didn't know what all those white boxes were back over there. I just knew that
Mhm.
there was something I wanted. Oh, well, let me try that. And so I tried new things because you're looking at all the covers, and but you really couldn't read it before. I mean, you could look at it, but they really didn't want to take it back. You know what I mean? So,
Oh yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so I started really getting into comics, and I ended up finding some other friends in school that loved comics, and they got me into all kinds of stuff. And I would try to draw these comics because I love to draw, and I just couldn't do it. I mean, it was the level of complexity was just crazy. And one day somebody brought a copy. It was the first issue of the Eastman and Laird's black and white Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm.
And it was in black and white, which I had never really, besides the comic strips in the daily paper, I had never seen a black and white comic, and suddenly I was like, I can draw these. I think I can. And so I drew turtles like nonstop, and I I fell in love with drawing comics and trying to emulate what I was doing, what they were doing. And um, but the friends I had, they weren't really into drawing. And so around that time, we ended up moving up to Atlanta, Georgia. And I finished out high school in Atlanta. And I met a few other people, and this was right around the time that the first Batman movie came out, right? So it was
Mhm.
like Batman
Mhm.
fever, like everything was Batman, Batman, Batman. And there was this kid in my class, and he drew this character that he called Bat Stick, and it was, if you can imagine this, it was a stick figure, but it had a Batman costume on, and um, I loved that concept because suddenly you're not worried about anatomy, you're not worried
Mhm.
about anything like that. You're just drawing stick figures and doing all kinds of stuff, and with these. But he actually did like a comic book. He didn't really do a comic book. He did like a page. And I can't imagine looking back how we had time to do this in class, but we did. This was
Mhm.
social studies, right? So um well, he was doing that, and I was like, I want to do that, but I don't want to copy what he did. So I decided to do a Spider-Man stick figure version. And I did like these whole comics, and I would show them to people, and it got really long and involved. And I never did anything but pencil him, and but I was telling stories. And when you first start to try to tell stories in comic book form, when you're really trying to do that, I mean, I didn't realize at the time, and the teachers definitely didn't see it as good, but that was
Mhm.
some serious storytelling. And I mean, if all of the things that you're trying to do, creative writing and, planning, and you have to outline it because you got to draw it, you got to know where it's going to go. And it just makes everything real, you know, and I loved it. It was so hard though. But I loved
Oh,
it.
yeah.
I absolutely fell in love with it. So this was high school, so, but I could never draw good anatomy or anything like that. So I never thought I could do this as a living, right? So I ended up going to school to be a graphic designer and tried a few things. And I got into web design. The web took off, and interface design. And I loved it and I was good at it, but I always secretly wanted to draw real stories for a living. And I thought I would do like picture books. That's what I thought I would do. So I
Mhm.
started like, this was the time, so this is now late 90s, um, where like Barnes and Noble was just everywhere. There was just, Borders, Barnes and Noble. And what we would do on our lunch hour, and I worked at this electronics place, and I did interface design for them. And it was actually Motorola. I was working on phones and all kinds of stuff like that. It's all pre-iPhone. But we were doing some amazing stuff. And on our lunch hour, we would go hang out at Barnes and Noble, which is like that's what a lot of people did, and I would find myself gravitating to the children's section just like I did when I was little. And I was checking out all of these picture books and everything. And I was amazed. I was like, oh my gosh, I really want to do this. I was getting disillusioned with my job. And what I found was that when I started trying to draw my own picture book stories, I was drawing comics instead. And
Mm.
so because that's what I had lived with and loved, and just it was built in, and so that's how it came out. So basically that's why I do what I do. It's stories that you would normally see in picture books, but I draw them in comic book form. So
Oh,
that's how it happened. Yeah.
very cool. Very cool. So
Yeah.
you have this whole world now of Alley,
Yeah.
and wordless, which is really interesting to me. I love
Yeah.
the wordless nature of it.
Well, and one of the reasons that it started out as wordless was because I didn't think I could write dialogue. I didn't think about that. I didn't, in my mind, there was dialogue, but it was like internal, right?
Hmm.
And I knew how to draw, but it's funny still when people see wordless comics, they're like, well, you didn't write it. It's like, well, actually I did write it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, if you think about it, it's just a story. It's just another kind of story, and every Owly story starts out as me telling a story as if like we're sitting around and I'm like, well, so Owly goes here and he does this. And it's like, there's no difference between that and actually writing. But for me, there was a mental block of writing dialogue. And when I would try to write dialogue, it came out really, really clumsy. And I was trying to make everything jokey, and it wasn't working. And so um, I decided that I wanted to finally do um, comics, and I wanted to try to find a publisher. And when I created the first little Owly story, I had dialogue, but I left it off because I was like, I don't think it's good. And I want to show them my art. I don't want them to get stuck on the dialogue. And when I showed it to who later became my editor at Top Shelf, he said, I don't think it needs dialogue. And I said, really? He was like, yeah. And because I inadvertently left it off, it made me work harder with the images to really
Yeah.
make sure that it was clear what was happening. And that so Ali stayed wordless for a long time. And now the difference is that lately, in just the past few years, so Owly's now published by Scholastic, and what they wanted to do was to try to find a way to bridge the audience that has trouble with wordless comics, which is something I don't understand, but it exists. There are people that look at wordless books and just they glaze over. They have no understanding of what that means. And I think that comes down to the language of comics, right? If you,
Mm,
but I mean, if you think about it though, if you're watching TV and the sound is down, you can still watch the story. You understand
mm,
what's happening. We've all watched hundreds of TVs in doctors' offices, dentist offices, someplace where you can't hear the audio, and you're following along, but for some reason there's a mental block for a lot of people when they open a book and there's no words and they get really confused, especially parents.
mm.
That's one of the things is that they look at it and they're like, so what do I do? If I want to read this to my kid, what do I do? And it's like, you just describe it. You just say, hey, look at what's Ali. Oh, Ali's doing this. And to me, that's so intuitive. I'm like, what do you mean? What
Mhm.
do you do? You just look at it and you go, oh, Allie, look at Allie picked up Wormy, and Wormy's like, hey, what are you doing over there? And it's like I'm making the dialogue up in my mind, right? Because that's what I do. And for a lot of people, they don't have that muscle in their mind. They just don't know what to do. And we wanted to try to figure out a way to help with that. And so basically, the new Owly stories have what I would describe as captions, so some of the characters have dialogue that they speak, but there's always icons associated with it, so you don't have to use the text, but it's
Mm.
there. And it's made a considerable difference in terms of of people coming to read Owly. It's crazy to me. I would have never seen that, but that's somebody that a publisher that's done this for years that understands the audience a little bit better than me, and so um, it's in my mind, it's not really different because it's the same story. It's just the dialogue that's there now is what was in my head, and I just put it down. But I still prefer the wordless version that's completely wordless because that's how I see it, in my mind, that's how I see it. But I've gotten used to doing it this way, and I think I've gotten a lot better at it. And I'm really happy with the way it's turned out now. But yeah, it's a special kind of magical thing that happens with wordless comics where I don't know, there's just something. It's almost like telepathy,
Mm.
that's how I would describe it, where it's like there's no way you could write down all of the words that are represented in those images. There's no way. It's like looking at a painting, and some people look at paintings in museums, you still see this, and they have to read what's underneath it. They absolutely have to read what the name of that painting is, who did
Mhm.
it, why they did it, and it's like that's unnecessary. You don't The artist did it specifically so you wouldn't have to know
Right.
anything about it, right? It's a form of communication, visual communication, but um it's not really valued. It's not valued as a language, and it's not understood. And I think that what I like to think is that I'm actually helping teach new people about that language through the comics, the way that I learned by reading comics that I loved, growing up and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and I lean toward the wordless initial copies myself, and there's just a beauty to that. And one of the things that I also want to make sure to mention for listeners is that you do have educators' guides, you have educators' resources on your website,
I do.
um, which
I
is
do.
a
And oh, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's a great thing for people to check out.
Well, I just that was part of that that initial thing where I mean you know one of the things about comics, and this is something that isn't as present with authors of regular books. I mean, it is a little bit, but the comic book convention system that is all around the country and all around the world exists in a way where you can basically go to any comic convention and meet the creators right
Hmm.
there. There's usually no line. You just walk up, you see them, but you can also see their work. Like you can actually, it's one of the best ways to get exposed to new work. You walk up, you see something, you sit down, you look at their, I mean, you browse through their books, you put them down. And I'll never forget this. I was at a convention in Florida, and this lady came up to me, and she was older, but not that old. Probably 50s maybe. And she was like, "Oh, I'm a librarian, and this looks really good." The kids in my school are, I mean, the kids that come to my library just love these books. And I was like, "Oh, great." And then she picked it up and she opened, this is one of the first graphic novels, and she looked at it and she was like, "There's no words." And she closed it and put it down and walked away and didn't even say goodbye or anything like that. It was just like, I don't know if I broke her brain or something. No, I'm kidding. But uh so the thing was, is I was like, I've got to find a way to reach out to people and let them to try to help, bridge
Mhm.
that thing. And so that was where it originally started, was trying to find a way to get adults excited about Owly, and if somebody loved Owly, to find a way to actually make it into a lesson and things like that. Because um, the strangest thing about all of this is that the kids have no problem reading anything. They just pick it up. It's a challenge to them. They're so excited. They're like, "Oh, what is this? What's going on?" And some kids get frustrated. That is true. But most kids, when they look at this stuff, they connect with it on such a different level that absolutely blows me away. And for somebody to not encourage that, or to actively stop them from experiencing this, because comics is reading, all books are reading. It doesn't really
Mhm.
matter if it's text or images or whatever. It's all about understanding and communication of ideas through written or drawn stuff. I mean, um, it's important. And so what I tried to do was I tried to bring some of that to life in a few little lessons that could be used in classrooms. And me and my mom actually came up with it, a couple of different ones. And some of them are just plain fun, but then other ones are like, using Owly's icon language, and trying to come up with neat new ways of doing things. And just as a way to kind of, if there's any teachers that are out there that are like, "Oh, well, this might be good," and if they love Owly, it's like it's there for them. And it's just a big PDF. It's all for free on my website. So
And that's so wonderful to have that resource there, and you are continuing to create in the world of Alley. So it's
I
I
am.
always like to point to books that have like multiple storylines and kind of that series effect, because I want to kind of close by giving you the chance to talk about what's next or upcoming events and those sort of things. And you mentioned at the beginning, before I started recording, that you just finished. Maybe was it literally today you
It's
just
yeah, no,
finished?
yes, actually just today. So yeah, I'm actually still working on the Alley series. So I um uh with Scholastic, I have it's 6 books that we're doing so far. I'm going to try to do more, but that's the deal I have right now with them. And so got 4 of them are out right now. And so um the 5th book is it's similar to the 5th version of Owly that came out in the wordless version, the black and white version of Owly. But what that is, it's this collection of short stories, basically all wrapped up into one big graphic novel. But I used a few different stories and left a few other stories out. But most importantly, I made a big connecting story for all of these little stories where, basically Owly and his friends are looking at a photo album. It's kind of like a sitcom clip show, where they're like, "Oh, you remember
Mm.
that thing?" And it's kind of like that. But I really love the new story that all ties it all together. It's really fun. Um, but so Owly 5, I literally just finished it today, um, or actually late this early this morning. So late last night, but technically early this morning. Um, and it is I forget how many it is. I think it's 8 or 9 little stories, all wrapped up into one big graphic novel. And the strange thing about that, and it took a long time to finish this book, way longer than we imagined, because it was almost like doing 9 separate books altogether at once, because every story you have to make sure it's super tight. There's no questions. It all ties through. And my editors at Scholastic are really great about that, just making sure everything works and everybody understands what's happening, because you can think it makes sense in your mind, but until it's on paper, it's totally different. So I made some changes to make it clearer, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. It's probably it was honestly the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life was this book, but I'm really proud of the way it turned out. So that will be out. I think it will be next year because there's a couple of delays because it took so long. Um, but yeah, the last page of every Owly book is actually the cover for the next book. And
Mhm.
so the thing that took me, that I literally just finished, is the cover for Owly 6, which is to come. And Owly 6 is completely brand new. It doesn't exist in black and white. It does technically somewhat exist because I planned to do it completely wordless um, years ago, but I never got to that point where it was done. And so now it's going to live on, and this will be the first public version of it. And so it'll technically be all new, and I'm really excited about that story. So it's got education and friendship and laughs and tears and highs and lows. I'm really excited about drawing that one. So that's what's next.
Awesome. Well, always glad to talk with you and share about the books and the resources that you offer, and always glad to see what's next in the world of Alley and you're creating. So thank you so much
Well,
for jumping on.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I haven't been doing as many conventions since the pandemic and stuff like that. But I wanted, if anybody's listening and they want me to do school visits, I do virtual school visits, for
Awesome.
very, very cheap, if anything, any cost at all. And so I will come and I've done this in the past. I've talked to little book clubs and classes and all kinds of stuff. So I will be updating my website real soon with all that new information. So if anybody out there wants to talk to me or ask questions like that, just feel free to reach out. I'm here.
And highly recommend author visits for those of you that are listening that are thinking, oh, that might be something for my class. Absolutely. That's a great way to connect with the world of authoring. So glad to hear that you are doing that as well.
Yeah, no, it's such a big deal because I don't know, as a kid, any kind of exposure to cartooning for me was so far, like where would you see it? Like some little clip on Magical World of Disney or something like that. But like
Mhm.
to have somebody actually show you what is happening, it's to feel the connection that the kids make, it's incredible. So
Well, thank you again. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
well, thank you. I appreciate it.